Okay, Dr. Sledge, you are free to start.
All right, I should start my video, which I'm not seeing, unfortunately. There we go. There we are. All right, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to this chat this evening entitled To the House Without Exit. And tonight we're going to talk a good bit about the afterlife as it enters into history, although we're also going to talk a good bit about the prehistory of the afterlife. The afterlife actually has a substantial prehistory, which is in some sense interesting because it has a kind of pre-life. The afterlife has a pre-life. So before I get started, just a few thanks. First and foremost, I want really to reach out and say thank you very much to the Flint Institute of Arts for providing this opportunity for me to give this talk about the history of the afterlife in two parts. And we're going to get all the way up in the second lecture to the kind of flowering of the afterlife. I also want to extend a very special thanks to Dr. Alan Klein, who sponsors the Sheppy Dog Lecture that this lecture is endowed by. The Sheppy Dog Lecture allows the FIA to present lectures and conversations about topics addressing art, religion, and history prior to the 19th century. And Dr. Klein has graciously endowed many lectures here at the FIA. And they are all really, really great. I really recommend that if you've not watched other lectures given by the other folks who've done this Sheppy Dog Lecture talk, those lectures are available. Many of them are available on the FIA's YouTube channel. I really recommend checking them out. They're really great. There are some on Houdini, art conservation, a wide range of things. Dr. Klein has very good taste, if I may say so myself. I really recommend checking those out and supporting the FIA. So the image you're seeing here on the very first slide is probably among the earliest images of the afterlife ever produced. It's interesting to think about our visualization of a place that most of us have never been, aside from the folks perhaps that have had near-death experiences. But for the rest of us, we've never been to the afterlife. And I think most of us are waiting patiently to get there. We're in no great rush. But here we have an image of what may be one of the earliest representations of the afterlife in all of art history. This is a cylinder seal, which is a small little seal that would have been used to sign one's personal documents in the ancient Sumerian world. This is an image of Dumuzid. He's there in the middle. He's in this sort of crate-like thing, and he's being tortured, unfortunately, by a group of what are called Gala demons. These Gala demons are torturing him in the afterlife. We'll talk a bit more about Dumuzid in just a bit as we get into the Sumerian afterlife, which I have to tell you, spoiler alert, is not terribly pleasant. I mean, the image here is a guy being tortured in the afterlife, so we're not surprised by that. But I think it's interesting always to look at these very early representations of the afterlife to get some sense of what people thought in this incredibly ancient time period. So the truth of the matter is that the afterlife began long before history, long before writing, and it began certainly long before, it perhaps begins even long before there are human beings. The observation of death, that is to say that death is a non-trivial thing, seems to be something that happens to many creatures, not just human beings. The most famous example, of course, are elephants, which, as you may know, in fact, mourn their dead. So far as we can tell, we can't really communicate with elephants, so we don't want to speak for them. But elephants do very elaborate rituals. This is to say behaviors that are repeated every time an elephant dies. And these behaviors go on from death of elephant to death of elephant. And in fact, we are known that elephants actually go out of their way on their migratory patterns to visit the bones of elephants that have died in years past. These are perhaps the most elaborate death rituals that we know of outside of the human world. And so we're unsurprised to know that even something that isn't even basically human, that's something that seems to be shared with us and other kinds of creatures, it's not surprising that from this basic building block of observing death and then ritualizing the reality of death, that this abstract understanding of what death is and that abstract observation of death, even in the non-human world, would be something that would become a kind of basic building block for something like an afterlife, right? We have to have an abstract understanding of death, and then an abstract way of dealing with death and recognizing death, and perhaps hoping that death isn't the end, in order to ever develop a notion of the afterlife. Now, I don't know what goes through the minds of elephants. I don't think any of us do. I don't speak elephantese. But I do want to say that we should hold out the possibility that the elephants do have some conception of an afterlife. One of the things we've learned in the past 20th century and into the 21st century is that non-human animals are much more like us than we often imagine. And so, as I say here on the slide, who's it for me to say that the elephant looking into the camera in this very powerful picture isn't imagining their fallen elephant kith or kin in some other place, in some better place, or perhaps even a worst place. We just don't know. For eons, human beings have occupied this strange little part of the Milky Way. Human beings have existed for roughly 200 to 250,000 years, which is difficult to wrap our minds around, that human beings have lived so long. Well, the most successful human beings living in the area of Eurasia were, of course, the Neanderthals, who disappeared about 35,000 years ago, which is relatively recent, all things told, in the scope of the world in general. And you may be surprised to learn that if you are a Western European person, you are probably carrying around Neanderthal DNA. We've done the sequencing of the Neanderthal DNA and of human DNA, and we've learned that the Neanderthals bred with human beings and Neanderthals hooked up, and we produced children that have in them some degree, about 4% of Neanderthal DNA. Now, the typical idea that I imagine comes to your mind of the Neanderthal is the caveman, right? Sort of slumped over, large forehead, grunting and just pounding things with a stick or something. That isn't what we know now about Neanderthals. They were incredibly sophisticated and complex human beings who had very highly developed lives and cultures. Now, we don't know a great deal about their culture, and we're only learning more about it. But one of the interesting things that we found is this grave in a cave in France. Graves, that is to say, the intentional burying of an individual in which that area is carefully demarcated, and then that individual is interred in that grave, tell us that the Neanderthals were very carefully preserving the dead. If they didn't care about the dead at all, if they thought that that death was simply a non-issue, then we would imagine they would simply leave them where they fell. But that isn't what we find. We are seeing evidence now emerging in recent archaeological discoveries of the Neanderthals, other human species, burying their dead. And although it is controversial, and I don't want to downplay this controversy, there is at least some evidence of the Neanderthals burying their dead with grave goods. Grave goods we know from other human burial sites of Homo sapiens, us, that there is a tradition of burying the dead with various kinds of objects. And as we get later on into history, there's an idea that you can carry those objects with you into the afterlife. Typically what we find in Neanderthal graves, in the rare cases we have found them, is evidence of pollen. And we have some reason to believe that the Neanderthals were burying at least some people with flowers. And so again, an incredibly touching and incredibly powerful expression that, again, we still put flowers onto the graves of our loved ones. And we find that the Neanderthals, a kind of human being somewhat different than us, may have also been placing flowers with their dead, burying them intentionally in various places throughout Eurasia. So this may indicate that the Neanderthals also had some conception of the afterlife. well before human beings even arrived in Europe or in Eurasia, it may be the case that the afterlife was already thriving in those regions. Now, of course, Neanderthals don't survive into modernity, and we don't know at all anything about what the Neanderthal worldview was, or how they conceptualize their world, or how they conceptualize something as complex as the afterlife. But it's at least a clue into the possibility of an afterlife that doesn't even include human beings. That is to say, a Neanderthal afterlife is at least possible. Of course, civilization didn't begin all at once. Civilization was a very slow process that kind of worked in jumps and goes, right? Sometimes it flew high and then it fell far. And so what we find is the first really rugged attempts at city building occurred primarily in southeastern Turkey at sites like Çatalhöyük. There in southeastern Turkey, we actually have the very first cities. These cities are interesting because they don't have roads. The cities are actually built one building attached to another building, and the roads are actually the tops of the buildings, the roofs of the buildings, and all of the buildings are actually accessible from the roof, and so you would go down into the roof to go into your home. It's a very different kind of urban planning than we find in the later attempts at civilization. Well, what's interesting about this proto-civilization that begins to exist about 10,000 BCE, just let that number settle in for a minute. 10,000 BCE, that's 10,000 years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. We have what may very likely be the very first temple ever constructed in the world. Dr. Klein, who is sponsoring this lecture, has had the great opportunity to go there. I've expressed my jealousy to him on several occasions that one of my hopes in life is to make the great pilgrimage to the site here that you're seeing on your screen of Göbekli Tepe. We don't know what this site is. As you can see, it is incredibly complex. Some of these pillars rise 4 or 5 meters into the air. This was all built in the Neolithic period, and we have no idea why they built this incredibly complicated temple site there in southeastern Turkey. The leading archaeologist who's excavated the site has argued that these entire structures here that you can see that are round may have been covered over, in that this may have been a kind of underground area in which shamanic practices of imitating the underworld may have transpired. The truth of the matter is we don't know. This site is completely mysterious, but the going theory is that this shrine or this temple was a kind of location for a Neolithic religion surrounded with the cult of the dead. That'll make more sense as we get to later Neolithic sites in just a moment. But we think, and we are fairly convinced, that this is the first temple ever built in history. And curiously enough, it's not even built in history. It's built actually over 5,000 years prior to the first written word appearing in Sumeria in what is now southern Iraq. Equally as mysterious, this site was used for about 2,000 years. And then for reasons that we also don't understand, it was buried. So I just want you to imagine the work that goes into raising all of these stones and all of this entire site using basically flint tools. That's what they had available to them. It was flint tools. They built this enormous site. They used it for a couple of thousand years, and then it was intentionally buried. Now, the burial of this site must have been a hugely communally resourceful event. And the amount of energy poured into burying the site is also shocking. We don't know why they buried it. It could have been some catastrophe, some failure of the gods, something, but at any rate, they buried the site. And luckily for us, or for us archaeologists, the site was buried perfectly intact, and it was only excavated beginning in the mid-20th century, and it is in a fantastic state of preservation. At other sites, other Neolithic sites in the ancient Near East, the most famous site being Jericho, we have a very similar kind of culture that functioned at Jericho, that functioned at Çatalhöyük, the city I described earlier, and we think very likely functioned at Göbekli Tepe. What we find at Jericho is that we see at the very earliest strata of that site, about 8,000 BCE, that those people actually took the bodies of their dead relatives, it seems to us. They would desiccate the body of the dead. They would cut the body of the dead up. They would bury the body minus the head under the ground of their home. Remember, these homes are actually all connected together, and you access them from the roof. They would bury the dead beneath their homes. Wealthy aristocrats in Europe still bury their dead in the crypts beneath their manor houses, so this is not that unusual. But the heads of the dead, and this is where we get into a much more contested issue, the skulls of the dead specifically would be taken off of the body. They would be cut off of the body, and then they would be treated. That is to say, there would be a layer of plaster applied to the skull, and then there would be various kinds of objects inserted into the plaster, like seashells into the eyes, and the plaster would be built up, and then there would be red ochre, a kind of red paint made from mineral, and that would paint the face, and it would allow them to add eyebrows and mustaches and things like this. And then these skulls decorated with the ochre, you can see the plaster here of the skull, and you can see the actual skull part itself protruding there from the top. These plastered skulls would actually be set into the wall of the homes. And so there is an idea that we think that the ancestors lived on in some sense with the people living in their homes. So these plastered skulls will be set into the walls, and that would be a kind of ancestor veneration, we think. Similar kind of practices were actually practiced in ancient Rome, where the funeral masks of people were made, and still to this day, sometimes funeral masks are made, and those funeral masks are displayed as one's ancestors. For roughly 3,000 years in the archaeological record, we find evidence of these plastered skulls. We found numerous of these plastered skulls from several Neolithic sites all throughout the ancient Levant. So we're talking about if this is a case of ancestor worship, there's an idea that the ancestors survive death and can be venerated by the living. If this number is right, and if we're right about what's going on here with this ancestor veneration, we're looking at a situation of about 3,000 years of what might be called the cult of the dead. So just to let that number settle in for a moment, 3,000 years is about as long as a religion like Judaism has existed. It's about 1,000 years longer than Christianity has existed, and it is about 2,000 years longer than Islam has existed. So by peering into the face of this person, this skull, this ancestor, we may be peering into the face of a religious object from a religion, the cult of the dead, that persisted for thousands of years longer than many religions that we currently observe in the world today. So we often think of our religions as lasting a very, very long time, but from 9,000 to 6,000 BCE, again, 3,000 years, the cult of ancestor worship that operated in the ancient Near East largely dwarfs many religions that exist now by perhaps 1,000 years. The Sumerians, of course, as you probably know, are the first people to enter into history. The Sumerians are a rather mysterious people. We're not quite sure where they come from, and we're not quite sure how they learned to write, but they did both of these things. They developed writing. The first written languages that we can read are in the Sumerian language. And because of the fact that the Sumerians wrote things down, they began writing primarily things like business contracts and receipts. But eventually they did begin to write down their religious legends. And their religious legends give us, or their mythology, give us the first insight into the afterlife in history. So we may say that with the Sumerians, the afterlife properly enters into history. And for the first time, we can talk about the afterlife in a concrete and historical manner. There are many tales of the afterlife in Mesopotamia and among the Sumerians and in their Semitic inheritors, the Babylonians, the Akkadians. The Sumerians tended to think of the afterlife as a kind of mountain, as a place called Kur. The word Kur means something like mountain in ancient Sumerian. It's typically associated with the Zagros Mountains there to the east.
Hi.
If you want to locate the Sumerians are there in southern Iraq, the area that we would now call southern Iraq. And they think of the afterlife as existing somewhere to the east of them in the Zagros Mountains. The most famous religious document that we have detailing the nature of the afterlife in the Sumerian mythology is a document called The Descent of Inanna or Ishtar. Ishtar is her Akkadian name. Inanna is her Sumerian name. You may know the name Esther. The name Esther is, in fact, a version of the name Ishtar. So the goddess Ishtar actually descends into the underworld to meet with her older sister, Ereshkigal. And Ereshkigal meets with her older sister, and what ends up happening is that in the underworld, Inanna becomes trapped. And we find the first reference, one of the earliest references to the afterlife mentioned there. The Akkadian text refers to it as Ana Biti Sha Erabisu La Atsu. This literally means it is the house for which those that enter do not come out. And that is actually the title of this lecture tonight. It is the house without exit. It's a place that you go, but you cannot leave. And so because one can go there, but one cannot leave, Inanna becomes trapped. We learn a great deal about the Sumerian idea of the afterlife. The image here is an image of Ishtar, or it could be her older sister, actually, the queen of the underworld. We're not quite sure, but we think it's either Ishtar or her older sister, Ereshkigal. The underworld in the Sumerian mythology is a dreary, lifeless, underground place. It has its own geography. There's a city down there called Dingir. There is a monarchy down there. It's ruled by a woman. So we have a queen of the underworld, Ereshkigal, the older sister of Inanna. There are citizens of the underworld. They have various tasks. And there's all kinds of drama down in the underworld itself. You can see here on the left, this is a cuneiform tablet in the Akkadian language, a language roughly related to Hebrew. It's an Eastern version. If you know a little bit of Arabic or Hebrew, the word biti, right? This is the word for house in Akkadian. If you know a little bit of Hebrew or Akkadian, you'll recognize perhaps the word bait or bite from Hebrew or Arabic right here. And you can see the very primitive version of this ancient language in Akkadian. The tablet here on the left is a version of the descent of Ishtar into the underworld. And during the Q&A section, if folks want some advice on some books, if you want to read some of these legends, I'm happy to provide them. As I said, the underworld here is a dreary place. It's kind of a negative image of our world, where our world is drenched in light. Their world and the underworld is drenched in death. And everybody goes there, whether you're good or bad, everyone goes into the afterlife. And the only thing that one has of solace in the Sumerian afterlife is whether or not you are buried with a lot of stuff, because unlike in our conception of the afterlife, we say you can't take it with you. The Sumerians believe that you could. So as long as you're buried with a bunch of stuff, you can bring it to the afterlife. The grave goods we mentioned earlier. But also if you're given libations and food, by the living, you can sort of persist in the afterlife there by being given, especially beer. Apparently, the living like beer, and so do the dead. The city is ruled over by the citadel of Ganzir, again, who is ruled over by Ereshkigal, the goddess of the dead. Her husband Nergal actually will eventually supplant her in later mythology. He becomes a kind of Hades-like character and supplants her in the mythology, although the earliest mythology has a queen of the underworld, not a king of the underworld. That will be changed in a later versions of the mythology. So as I mentioned, what happens is that Inanna descends into the underworld to meet with her elder sister and becomes trapped. The gods become worried about her. And what ends up happening is that there have to be a kind of exchange. She has to be exchanged for her husband, who I hate to admit was not appropriately mourning her being trapped in the underworld. And so she gladly sent him, Dumuzid, the god of the shepherds, into the underworld as a kind of hostage. And eventually he doesn't want to be a hostage. And so his sister, Geshinana, is also taken down. And what ends up happening is that Dumuzid and Geshinana rotate their responsibility as dual hostages in the underworld, so that Inanna, the queen of heaven, can leave in the underworld. Again, as I mentioned, right here we have Dumuzid, which you may know actually if you know the Jewish month of Tammuz. Dumuzid's name is a Sumerian name. His Akkadian name is Tammuz. And the month of Tammuz, the month that also exists in the Babylonian calendar and the month that exists also in the Jewish calendar, Tammuz, that's Tammuz actually in the underworld being tortured again by the terrible Gala demons. And as you might imagine, the underworld is inhabited by all kinds of nasty supernatural beings. The Gala demons being one. Lamashtu, the killer of children, also lives down there along with her brother Pazuzu. You may recognize Pazuzu as the demon that possesses the young woman in The Exorcist, along with the Giddim. The Giddim are the Yetimu, or the ghosts of the dead. And many of these Giddim or Atimu, according to ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian medical theory, actually were responsible for sickness. So if you got sick, if you had epilepsy or a fever, or if you had various kinds of medical ailments, the Giddim or the Atimu, the Giddim are the name of them in Sumerian, the Atemu are the name in Akkadian. They were responsible for your sickness. And a great deal of ancient Sumerian and ancient Mesopotamian medicine is actually wrapped up in exorcising these malevolent ghosts who have escaped from Ganzir and have infected the living. So again, a very early depiction of the afterlife, a not terribly pleasant afterlife, I say, but the afterlife just the same here in this Sumerian scroll. It's in Egypt. As you might imagine, the Egyptians are a people known for their dedication to the afterlife. It's in Egypt that the afterlife perhaps undergoes the greatest transformation in all of history. Indeed, we even know the name of the first person in ancient Egypt to achieve immortality. That is to say, they never died. They just changed. Now, I know you might think they died, but just like you were a fetus and then you were born and you were a child and now you're an adult and eventually you'll die, well, you won't die. You'll just change. Just like a fetus changes into a person, one might say that a person changes into an after person. And of course, that person is the Pharaoh Unas. We don't know quite how his name was pronounced. There's some debate about his name. Although if you want to see his name in hieroglyphics, his name is right there. You can see the wiggle line there is an N sound in the Egyptian language, and his name there is actually in the hieroglyphs. And you can see this phrase live Unas," over and over and over again in his pyramid, if you ever visit Saqqara there in the vast necropolis just south of the Giza Plateau, where the big pyramids are. The smaller pyramids there are actually much earlier, and Unas perhaps is the very first person in history to achieve mortality. Now, Unas is not a god. He was a living person. He was a pharaoh. We know his name. He's not Dumuzid. He's not a god who goes into the afterlife. He is, in fact, Unas is actually a person who we actually can read his name on the pyramid texts. And for what we know, he is the first person in written language to achieve immortality. Now, I know that the pyramids are typically called tombs. Perhaps you visited Egypt, I have, and you perhaps gone on a tour and they will tell you that the pyramids are tombs. The pyramids are not tombs. The pyramids are devices for immortality. No person gets put into a pyramid if they're going to die. A person only gets put into a pyramid if they intend to live forever. So you should think about the pyramids not as tombs, but as immortalization machines. And so the pyramids were built precisely to immortalize the people inside them. You're not buried in a pyramid, you're immortalized in a pyramid. So again, we should shift our conception of what's going on in these buildings. And if we understand the architecture of these buildings as tombs, we fundamentally make a mistake. And we know that because among the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions to be found in the ancient world, in the ancient Egyptian world, are what are called the pyramid text. You're looking at a very small section of about 200 spells found in the pyramid of Unas. And these spells are spells that protect Unas and allow Unas to enter into the afterlife. Again, if you'd like to read some of these spells, I can provide some folks with sources during the Q&A. There's a really great volume that publishes all of the pyramid text, all the very ancient, very earliest magical documents of ancient Egypt. And they are basically spells for immortalization of these pharaohs. Well, pharaohs aren't the only people that want to become immortal. Immortality seems like a thing that many of us are after. And so what we get in many of these texts, is that we get the idea that everybody wants to live forever. And what ends up developing is a kind of institutional form of religion in which, in the earliest versions of the Egyptian afterlife, the Ka, the soul, a very important concept, the Ka, or soul, soars upward into the sky after death. There's a specific group of stars, we think, that the soul actually ascended to. And this ability to survive death became enshrined in a series of mythologies around the god Osiris, the god of the dead. Now, again, god of the dead is a kind of wrong way of thinking about this, because Osiris doesn't die. He's killed by his brother Set, but then he's reborn, right? So again, just like you might go into a coma, God forbid, or you might go to sleep, you went to sleep, but you woke up. Well, we don't think that you're dead when you're asleep. Well, Osiris wasn't dead when he was dead. He was resurrected eventually, and he lives on forever, just as you may be as well. So the ability to survive death, the ability to engage in resurrection, was a foundational myth early on in the Osiris mythology. And it combines some fertility god ideas, which make a lot of sense when it comes to resurrection, with ideas of a god who's kind of a lord of the underworld. And this unified both the lower and the upper Egyptian mythologies into one coherent mythology. And so what we have over the long course of ancient Egypt is a very slow but dramatic transition in the theory of the afterlife, where the afterlife in the very early Egyptian mythology is located in the stars very far away. What ends up happening is the afterlife is eventually brought down to Egypt, and eventually the afterlife, the person that goes into the afterlife, dwells on a kind of golden bark. This is a kind of boat, and eventually the afterlife is thought of as a kind of beautiful Egypt, the lush green marshlands of Egypt, where the beer never stops flowing and the music never stops playing, which in the end, I can't say one should complain much about. If you're curious here, what you're seeing here on the screen is an image of a mummified person. Mummification, of course, just preserves the body, but the person's Ka or Ba, we're not quite sure. This is their representation of the soul taking wings and flying away. Of course, if you've ever heard many Christian and hymns, right? This fine morning I'll fly away. This idea of flying away, that the soul will fly away to the afterlife, we can already see represented here with the literal flight of a kind of bird-like soul entity in the ancient Egyptian world. Now, what ends up happening is that there is a transition. Whereas in the very early period of the Egyptian empire, it is thought that the pharaoh and the pharaoh alone is capable of immortalization. What ends up happening was that the afterlife becomes democratized. What you're looking at here on the screen is perhaps the most famous image of the afterlife, I think, in many ways in all of history. This is an example of the papyrus. This is the Papyrus of Ani that was written down around 1250 before the Common Era. If you're curious, this would have been during roughly the reign of Ramses the Great. What you see here is an image of the afterlife during the New Kingdom, where a middle-class person, this is a priest, Ani was a priest, he's being led by Anubis, the god of the dead, again, somewhat of a misnomer, but he's being led to these scales. And what's happening here is that Anubis is measuring his heart, which you can see here on the left, against this feather. Now, the feather represents the cosmic idea of ma'at, or justice, in the ancient Egyptian mythology. Justice was a cosmic force in the Egyptian religious worldview. And you see here the god Thoth, the ibis-headed god Thoth, the god of writing and magic, recording what's going on. And the idea here is, if your heart is so laden with evil, with sin, that it is heavier than the feather of justice. If your heart is heavier, well, we have our friend Amit, the terrifying demon who is basically composed of a crocodile and a lion and a hippo, which is a terrible combination. This entity here eats your soul. They eat your heart, and you go into non-existence. There's no Egyptian hell. You just get eaten. Your soul gets eaten, and you go away forever. It's oblivion for you. But as we can see here, on Ani, the priest being led by Anubis, passes the test, right? The feather of justice is heavier than his heart, and he is brought here by Horus, the brother of Osiris, and he is able to join here with Osiris, and he will enter into the afterlife forever. This document, the Papyrus of Ani, here we have a different version of the papyrus that I just mentioned. These were custom made in the New Kingdom. That is to say, they were custom made for the individual. And the idea was, these are sort of like spell books or travel guides. If you ever use a travel guide to go to another country, these are basically travel guides for the reborn. And so these were printed, or not printed rather, but copied by scribes. You could have them custom made for you so that when you were buried, you would know exactly what you wanted to do as you were being resurrected, and you would know exactly how to go through the process of surviving your own death. Now, to be clear, the Egyptian afterlife is incredibly complicated. It changes several times, as I mentioned, and even the mechanics of what survives changes. So one can describe oneself as an Ach, a kind of life that is reborn. There is the Ka, that is sort of the soul that survives after death. There is one's Ba. The Ba is the part of you that is your personality. It's all the things that you are, your memories and so forth. Your Ib is your heart. That is a part of you that's weighed in the balance scales. But what's important about all this, right, is the Egyptians have an incredibly sophisticated theory of the afterlife. And what matters in this, at least later version of the afterlife, is that it becomes democratized. Everyone can go to the afterlife, assuming you've lived a righteous life. What's interesting about this idea of the afterlife as well is there's really cool Egyptian literature that I can also give folks some recommendations for if you're interested at the end of the lecture about Egyptian literature, which is really incredible. And they're really interesting, almost proto-existential documents about suicidal people, depressed people debating whether they should commit suicide, and the soul telling them, don't do that, life is worth living, I'll live forever, there's no rush to be dead, etc. Along with some really old ghost stories. Some of the earliest ghost stories we have in the ancient world are Egyptian, because again, you need a soul to get a ghost at some level, and we have those stories in ancient Egyptian. Now, I can't understate how important this concept is. The idea that depending on how you live this life affects what happens to you in the next life. I cannot understate how important that idea is. I bet the vast majority of people here listening to this lecture believe some version of that. If you believe some version of that, you can in many ways trace that belief back to the Egyptians and not back to the Israelites, as we'll see in just a moment. So between the Egyptians and the ancient Babylonians, the ancient Mesopotamian people were the Canaanites. The Canaanites were the people that lived in what is now Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine. And they flourished around the time period of the Bronze Age until the Bronze Age collapsed in around 1200 before the Common Era, excuse me. We didn't know much about these people aside from the literature of the Israelites, who are a kind of Canaanites, until a site was discovered in the early 20th century at a place called Ugarit, which is in now modern day Syria. And it was there that we learned an enormous amount. We actually found a royal archive of a pre-Bronze Age collapse major city at Ugarit. And the Ugaritic language, thank goodness, is actually written in an alphabet. The language is very similar to Hebrew. In fact, if you read Hebrew, you can almost kind of read Ugaritic a little bit. But what we found there are enormous amounts of literature, and the major piece of religious literature that we found at Ugarit was what is called the Baal cycle. Now, for many Christians and Jews listening, the name Baal probably strikes fear into your heart. You know that Baal is bad, and that the God of the Bible fights with Baal, and the prophets of Elijah dueled with Baal, and Baal, it should never be worshipped. That's the Israelite perspective. For the Canaanites, these people who lived in this region long before there were ever such thing as Israelites, Baal was the good guy. Baal was the storm god. Baal brought the rain in the winter that allowed the crops to grow. There's a reason why the Bible doesn't like Baal. The reason why the Bible doesn't like Baal is because he's the chief competitor to the Israelite God, right? And so Baal was incredibly popular among the Canaanites. And one of the things that happens in the Baal epic, the epic of Baal that we recovered at the Ugaritic site there, is that Baal becomes the major god. He eventually he supersedes the older elderly god El, who you might recognize the word El as a word for God in Hebrew. It's the exact same name in Ugaritic. But El is superseded when the younger Baal defeats Yam, the forces of chaos, as represented by the ocean, and also Mot, right? And again, you can even hear this if you understand Hebrew, like Mavet, right? Memvav Tav, right? The idea of Mot, of death. And Baal defeats death, and he actually goes into the underworld. He is temporarily killed by Mot, which is unsurprisingly because he's death after all. But Baal's sister Anat, who is maybe one of the fiercest women in all of mythology. Anat is the scariest woman in all of mythology in many ways. But Anat actually storms down into the kingdom of Mot, into the kingdom of death, and she kills death. She rips him to pieces. And what we have in the story of Baal, in the epic of Baal, is the idea that what ends up happening is that Baal ultimately triumphs over death, but death reemerges. Death can't die because, well, obviously it's death, right? Death kind of lives forever, weirdly enough. But what we get in the story here is that Baal and Mot will battle forever, where Baal always wins in the winter, bringing the rain into the area of Syria and Palestine and Israel and what is now Lebanon. But Mot survives in the summer, and Mot brings the power of drought and death. And so the arid, dry period of the year is ruled by Mot, but Baal defeats him during the winter and brings the nourishing, life-giving rains. So again, you can see why Baal was quite popular, despite the fact that the Bible, if you've read chunks about the Bible does not like Baal, but he was very popular. Here he is here in a figure. You can see here he's casting a lightning bolt. Baal was a god of the storm, and you can see him casting lightning bolts down. In fact, there are several psalms in the Hebrew Bible that we think were actually originally hymns to Baal that were actually repurposed to praise the Israelite gods. They kind of cut and pasted the names in, and so rather than praising Baal, they praised the Israelite God. We now come to the most famous of all of the Canaanites. The most famous of all the Canaanites, of course, were the Israelites. The Israelites, I think many of us know. Some of us love them. Some of us have a love-hate relationship with the Israelites, or being an Israelite. The Israelite afterlife no longer exists. As you may know, heaven and hell are a much later concept. We'll briefly touch on it tonight, and in the next lecture, we will be dealing with heaven and hell extensively. However, it is in another kind of afterlife that existed among the Israelites, a place called Sheol, that dominates the Israelite idea of the afterlife. This is a literal underworld, and in this place, all of the dead go, the good, the bad, the ugly. Everybody goes to the world of Sheol, and it is a place marked by gloom and weakness and inactivity. We are told in the Hebrew Bible that the dead cannot praise God, and there they will spend eternity. Sheol is mentioned over and over again. It's mentioned 66 times in the Hebrew Bible, and it is mentioned nowhere else, with one exception, anywhere other than the Hebrew Bible. This is absolutely the concept of the afterlife as it occurs in the Hebrew Bible, otherwise known by Christians as the Old Testament. this is a place where everyone goes. It's not a place of punishment. It's not a place of reward. It's simply a gloomy, dark, desolate place where nothing changes and you're basically trapped there forever. Now, that doesn't sound like a great selling point for Sheol, but if you read the Hebrew Bible and you look at the various ideas that come along there in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, Sheol is a place to be feared. In fact, no one wants to go there, but everyone knows that they will go there. If you're interested in Sheol, on my YouTube channel, which I host a new episode every week, I'll be doing an entire episode, a deep dive into everything we know about Sheol this Friday at 1. I'll put a link to my YouTube channel in the chat box here during the question and answer sections. So if you want to learn more about the actual Israelite theory of the afterlife, check out my YouTube channel this Friday afternoon for an episode on Sheol. We do know that at least one person in the Hebrew Bible was called out of Sheol. This is the prophet Samuel, who was resurrected by a sometimes referred to as a witch. She summons Samuel out of the grave so that Saul can know what's going to happen to him in his war with the Philistines. Of course, the news is bad because obviously the news is bad for poor Saul. He's going to lose the war and he will die the next day. But this magical event that happens in the book of Samuel is one of the oldest examples of magic to resurrect the dead. And we actually have the example here of Samuel being resurrected from this afterlife Sheol, and an incredibly interesting story there in the Bible. What's important also to note is that the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible ever recovered are very tiny silver scrolls that were recovered from tombs near Jerusalem. So what we know is that this interaction with the dead was a very important part of ancient Israelite mythology, and that Sheol was the afterlife that they imagined. And it was nothing like heaven, and it was nothing like hell. It was a kind of cavernous, deep, underground, dark, gloomy world. And it went extinct. Sheol is no longer the official afterlife of Judaism. It is no longer the official afterlife of Christianity, and it is no longer the afterlife of Islam. Sheol went extinct, right? Sheol went extinct. It's no longer a place that people believe in. There to the east, we have the famed Zoroastrian religion. This is the religion of Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen, among many other Zoroastrians. This religion was founded by Zarathustra. Although we don't know a great deal about Zarathustra, we don't even really know when he was born. We have a vague idea. And so we don't know exactly how Zarathustrian ideas affected Greek and Israelite ideas, but we know without a doubt they did, because we can see all kinds of parallels that seem to never occur in the Hebrew Bible or in other religions, but they occur only in the Zoroastrian religion. And we are fairly confident that contact between the Israelites, the Greeks, and other peoples, which with the Zoroastrians, deeply influenced many of these ideas. And one of those ideas is a dualistic understanding of the afterlife. As you may know, Zoroastrianism believes that there is a good God and a bad God, and those good God and the bad God fight each other. And eventually the good God will win because a kind of messianic character will motivate all of the pious Zoroastrians to defeat the bad God. And at the end of the world, the evil God will be defeated, and there will be all the bad people will go to a bad place. All the good people will go to a good place. If that sounds familiar to you as Christianity or Judaism or Islam, it's not. It's Zoroastrian. And so Zoroastrianism very likely influenced all of these ideas. So what we get in the Zoroastrian afterlife is an idea that when you die, depending on if you were a good person or a bad person, you come to a bridge, right? You come to a bridge. This bridge is sometimes described in all kinds of different ways, but one comes to this bridge. And if you were a good person, you will see a goddess. This goddess is the goddess of judgment. And if you are a good person, you will see her as beautiful, and she will guide you into the house of song, the afterlife of the Zoroastrians, that is beautiful and pleasant and is quite lovely, in fact. But If you come upon the Chinvat Bridge, this is the name of the bridge that one crosses in order to get to the afterlife. If one encounters Dena, or conscience, as a bad person, if you were a sinful person, the image, the goddess of the conscience, Dena, will appear as a kind of evil hag, and she will cast you off the bridge, and you will enter into what is called the House of Lies, and you will spend all of eternity being tortured there, at least for a while. At the end of time, you will be physically resurrected. You will be judged by Ahura Mazda, the good god. If you drive a Mazda, the name Mazda comes from the good god of the Zoroastrians. And if you were a good person, you will be allowed to stay in the House of Life. If you've repented of your sins somewhat, you will be allowed to leave. But if you're a really bad person, you will be stuck in the House of Lies forever. You can see here a Persian Zoroastrian manuscript from the 18th century, where people being tortured by various kinds of demons in the afterlife. So you have all kinds of demons eating people's stomachs and doing dreadful things that demons do, obviously. There is a Zoroastrian book written sometime during the 3rd to the 7th centuries called the Book of Arda Viraf, written during the Sasanian period. And what's interesting is that in the Book of Arda Viraf, it means the book of the righteous person Viraf, he goes into a dream, and he actually goes on a tour of the various heavens and hells. There are several different heavens and hells in the Zoroastrian worldview. And this book, the Book of Arda Viraf, we think is a kind of precursor to Dante's Divine Comedy. Of course, Dante is taken on a tour of the afterlife with Virgil and eventually with Beatrice, his beloved, and they go on a tour of hell, purgatory, and heaven. Well, the Book of Arda Viraf is a kind of precursor to Dante's Divine Comedy. You actually can read it online. It's about 8,000 lines long, but it is a tour, the earliest tour of heaven and hell as you might recognize them. In fact, if you didn't know that it was a Zoroastrian text, and I told you that it was a Christian or a Muslim text, you may very well be fooled, because it reads so much like a Christian or an Islamic text, and we are very confident that the influence goes from Zoroastrianism onto Judaism to Christianity as a kind of circuit there among the Zoroastrians. Let's see. Of course, to the west of the ancient Israelites are the Greeks. You can see here an image of Hades with his three-headed dog, Cerberus. I think for many of us, the Greek afterlife is without a doubt the most familiar. And for most of us, we know the Greek afterlife best of all. We know the story of Persephone. We know the story of Demeter. We know the story of Hades, the brother of Zeus. We know the story of Chiron, the grim boatman who takes you to the underworld. We know the various rivers of the Greeks, the river Styx, and the other rivers, the other four rivers that dominate the world of the afterlife in Greek mythology. In fact, I dare to say, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I would dare say that your vision of the afterlife is probably much more informed by Greek mythology than it is by Israelite mythology. I imagine none of you believe in Sheol, but I do imagine that many of you believe in something like beautiful fields forever, and some of you imagine a world where you're burned forever in torment. Those ideas are primarily coming from the Greeks and from the Zoroastrians, and not from the Israelites, right? Remember, the Israelite underworld, Sheol, has no punishment and no reward whatsoever. The main influence that we get from the ancient Greeks are three interlocking ideas. One is the mythological and the thematic context of the topology of the ancient Greek world. If you've ever read, for instance, Dante, which is a huge influence on the way that we think about the underworld, especially in Christian thinking, the very structure of the underworld is still built around the Greek mythological underworld of Tartarus and Hades and things like that. The other major idea is the mystery cults and the rituals for obtaining life in the afterlife. We'll mention those more in just a moment. And of course, the other is the philosophical and the speculative aspects of the Greek afterlife that were developed by Greek philosophy with people primarily like Socrates and especially Plato. Of course, the mythological component is very, very important. Many aspects of imagining the afterlife for many Christians and many Muslims are deeply influenced by Hellenistic or by Greek ideas of the afterlife. And many of these ideas of a going down into a world where you could be tortured or going up into a world where you'll be rewarded, these kinds of ideas that the afterlife is in the heavens, those ideas are fundamentally Greek. And those ideas deeply influenced Judaism, and they deeply influenced Christianity and Islam via Judaism. And many of those ideas are coming from Egyptian and Mesopotamian mythological traditions. One major idea, both in the Greek, in the Mesopotamian, and in the Egyptian literature, is the idea that a very powerful person will go into the afterlife and they will rescue the people in the afterlife. That exact idea occurs in Christianity. Jesus, when he is executed, goes into hell. This is sometimes called the harrowing of hell, and he rescues the people that are down in there, and he defeats death. Well, we already see the idea of defeating death in the Ugaritic mythology. We have the idea of going down into death and coming out with Dumuzi and with Osiris. The idea of surviving and being reborn from death are ideas found all throughout the ancient Near East, although, again, ironically, not with the Israelites. There is no Israelite story where someone goes into Sheol and emerges out again. It never occurs in Israelite mythology, and yet it occurs in every other mythology, including Christian mythology, including Christian religious ideas. What we have also, of course, in the afterlife here would be the mystery cults. The mystery cults, like the cult of Eleusis and eventually the Roman cult of the god Mithras, are ideas in which one must personally undergo going into the afterlife, experiencing the process of death, and then being reborn. So in many of the mystery cults, especially the Eleusis cult, which is deeply connected to Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, who also is deeply connected to the afterlife, and Mithras also, we have the idea of undergoing death and being born again. That idea of being born again after one experiences one's death, or one experiences one's existence as a kind of death, is going to have an enormous impact on how we think about religiosity. Even the phrase born again is going to be an enormously important phrase in the development of Christianity. And of course, the philosophers should not be left out of this. It'd be a shame for me to leave out the philosophers, given that I think I am one, or at least I'm trained to be one. Who knows how good of one I am? But of course, Pythagoras would adopt the idea of the soul from Egypt. As you may know, Pythagoras, known for his famous Pythagorean theorem, was very interested in triangles. And of course, if you wanted to learn about triangles in the ancient world, the best place to learn about triangles in the ancient world was, you guessed it, Egypt. The Egyptians, as you might suspect, know something about triangles. And so Pythagoras visited Egypt. He actually learned about the idea of the soul, the immortal idea of the soul from Egyptian religion. He thought this was a fantastic idea. He brought it back to Plato. He taught it to his student Plato. And of course, Plato intensely popularized the idea of the soul in the ancient Greek world. In fact, when Plato introduced the idea of the soul and the immortality of the soul, many writers at the time thought Plato was crazy, because the Greeks thought, yes, you have a soul, but after you die, it kind of dissipates. But Plato says, no, the soul existed prior to your birth. It exists, it is you, the soul is you, and it will survive after you die. And this idea of the immortality of the soul will go on via Plato to basically influence all of Western philosophy and all of Western religious thought. In fact, I highly suspect that if you think you have a soul, it is probably because of Plato and not because of Israelite religion. It is Plato that really develops the idea of the soul. And of course, with the conquests of Alexander, he's not called Alexander the Great for no reason. With the conquests of Alexander, what would end up happening is that the idea of the soul, developed and synthesized primarily in ancient Greece, would be deposited all over the ancient Mediterranean, including in the areas in which Hellenization reached Judea, and the Jewish people, mixing some of their ideas with Zoroastrianism, would develop a radically new idea of religiosity in that radically new idea of religiosity is called apocalypticism. And with the rise of apocalypticism, we get the afterlife that I imagine all of you recognize. That is to say, the resurrection of the dead, the judgment of the dead, the eternal punishment of hell or Gehenna, the eternal reward of heaven. All of those ideas are the result of an apocalyptic reimagining of the afterlife. We may say, as I do on the slide here, that the house without exit gets remodeled. And what does it get in the remodel? It doesn't get a new sink, it gets an exit. The house without exit gets an exit. And it gets that exit because of the rise of a new form of religion called apocalypticism. And that new apocalyptic version of Judaism is going to develop the heavens and the hells, the angels and the demons, the devil, and all of those ideas that all have affected all of us in Western civilization. Those ideas are going to develop primarily in the period of the apocalyptic mode of Judaism, the rise of Christianity and Islam. And of course, the afterlife will continue to change well after the apocalyptic period. In fact, we'll even see the rise of ideas like reincarnation, other ideas as well. So as you may see, even the afterlife has an afterlife. Sheol went extinct, but even the idea that the afterlife itself has an afterlife, and we are living in some sense, right? After thousands and thousands of years, you'll notice here at the end of the lecture, we are only getting at the end of the first lecture to an afterlife that might be recognizable by all of you. If you're curious, this image is from the Dura Europa Synagogue, which represents the resurrection of the body for the first time in art. For the first time in an artistic depiction, this is the prophet Ezekiel, and you can see angels here resurrecting the dead, and the dead here are coming, and you see here dead people being hacked, they're hacked to pieces, they're being put back together, and they're coming back to life. That is the first image, the earliest image we have of the resurrection of the dead in ancient art. So folks, I hope I see all of you back next week for a further conversation about the world of the rise of the afterlife as we know it. You'll see that as next week, the afterlife as we know it is actually a lot more complicated and has a much more complicated history. But if you want to stay in touch, and I hope you do, please check out my YouTube channel. This is a channel where I explore all kinds of esoteric topics. You can find that link here. I can put it in the chat. If folks want it, you can check out my YouTube channel. Like I said, this Friday, I'll be doing a deep dive on the concept of Sheol, the Israelite Afterlife, if you're curious more about that. And of course, if you have further questions that you don't get to ask tonight, you can also reach me at my website, just justinsledge.com. So folks, I would love to open it up for some Q&A. I think we have about half an hour for Q&A. So if you have questions about this very early period of the afterlife, feel free to put them into the chat. I would love for you to love to talk to some of your questions, answer some of your questions, and just hang out for about a half an hour if you are interested. All right. So I'm seeing just a couple questions here so far. The best text for looking at some of these resources is, and I can put a link to these maybe I can send a link to a bunch of different books on to the folks at the FAA if they want to put these up, and some of these books. So the major text here that's worth looking at is the Pyramid Spells. There's an edition of it. I should have actually got all these links together. I'm sorry I didn't do that beforehand. But the entire Pyramid Spells are the Pyramid text are actually published in one edition. You can find those. I will, if you contact me via my website, I can actually send you a link to an edition of those texts. And they really need to read. They're a little difficult to understand because the Egyptian is so old. But it is really neat to read some of the spells of Unas and other people to see how these ideas developed over time. Yeah, thanks, folks. My religious background, I am Jewish. I belong to the Reconstructionist movement. All right. I see some other folks just liking the talk. So thanks very much for that. Yeah, I think the most interesting thing here, right, is that the afterlife evolves, right? The afterlife is not a thing that was written in stone. The afterlife is an evolving concept that developed over time. And because it developed over time, one can see all kinds of changes and various kinds of afterlives that developed all over time. Yeah, so my YouTube channel, Janet, is I focus in a very obscure area of academic study. That very obscure area of academic study is what is called Western esotericism. We study things like magic, alchemy, witchcraft, and these various kinds of ideas. And so we study them from an academic point of view, and I produce episodes and videos on topics in those things. So everything from magic, obscure ideas of the afterlife, and things like that. So it's it's a very fun place to do academic work. It has a fun place to do academic work. Do we know of any interactions between the storm god Baal and the humans or Canaanites? Yeah, you know what's interesting is that we don't have, at least in the Baal cycle, there's not much about interacting with Baal. People clearly prayed to Baal, and there definitely was an interaction with Baal. But the main place that people really interacted with in the ancient Canaanite world was in a kind of symposium for the dead. So particularly what could happen is that when the ancient Canaanites died, they went into an afterlife very similar to the Israelites, a kind of dark underworld place, moat. But at certain times of the year, they could return. They could come back from the dead. And these beings that came back from the dead are sometimes referred to as Rapi Una. We're not quite sure how to pronounce their name because we don't have the vowels, so we don't know how to say it. But these beings could come back, and what you could do is you could host a kind of drinking party. And this drinking party was called a marzich or a marzeach, and the dead would come with you and they would drink with you and you get drunk with you to celebrate the arrival of the new year. So we do know that at least the dead could come out of their underworld, at least in the Canaanite mythology, and they could survive into the marzich or the mosaic, these drinking parties. What's interesting is that sometimes, only about 6 times in the Hebrew Bible, the dead are referred to as Rephaim. And Rephaim it's the exact same word in Hebrew as in Ugaritic. And we know that the Rephaim, at least in the Hebrew, at least in about 6 cases, refer to the dead. Sometimes referred just to sort of the denizens of the underworld. And so the Rephaim actually also exist in the Hebrew Bible, although they don't talk about them very much. And we know that there are 2 different cases in the Hebrew Bible where the drinking party, the marzich or the marzeach, are actually mentioned in the prophet Amos and in the prophet Jeremiah, where it's very clear that for these Israelite prophets, that the drinking parties with the dead are absolutely forbidden. You're not allowed to go to these drinking parties with the dead, and so they are condemned. And so we do have the Israelites knowing of these more archaic Canaanite practices, but forbidding them. We also know that there was a practice of mutilating yourself in memory of the dead. And of course, we actually have in the book of Leviticus a very specific commandment in the Bible to not mutilate yourself in memory of the dead. And that becomes actually the foundational idea in the rabbinical law about not getting tattoos. In the Bible, there's an idea that one shouldn't get tattoos, and it actually has everything to do with this connection between the dead, mutilating your body for the dead, and eventually that becomes a prohibition on tattooing. So this idea is still there in the Hebrew Bible, although it's very easy to miss unless you know a lot about the cultural situation of the Israelites in their larger cultural setting. Let's see here. Yes, no, absolutely. Judaism, the Hebrew Bible borrowed all over. So the Hebrew Bible borrows from Canaanite religion. It borrows from the Mesopotamian religion. The flood myth is certainly there to be found in the Gilgamesh story with Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim is the character of Noah in that story. And so, absolutely, what ends up happening is that we have good reason to believe that the Israelite concept of Sheol is being primarily adopted not from ancient Egypt, but from ancient Mesopotamia, that they're repurposing many ancient Mesopotamian ideas and importing them into a specifically Israelite understanding of the afterlife. In fact, scholars think that the only mention of Sheol outside of the Bible is from a letter from the Elephantine Islands. Is from the Elephantine Islands. And the only other two possible places is that we see a epithet for the goddess Erishkigal, the ruler of the world of the dead in ancient Mesopotamian mythology. Sometimes she's referred to as Shuwala. There are two places in Akkadian where she's referred to as Shuwala. And some scholars think that the reference to the calling of her Shuwala is a word that gets imported for reasons that we don't understand and we don't really grasp, that gets imported into Judaism, and that becomes the word Sheol. Maybe. We don't know. We don't know what this word means. So there's no doubt that the ancient Israelites were influenced by all kinds of people around them, and certainly that influence coming from Mesopotamia, Catherine, is very, very strong indeed. Very, very strong indeed. The Dura Europa synagogue, it is, unfortunately, it doesn't exist. It was destroyed by ISIS. It is in Syria. It was built in sometime in the 5th or 6th centuries of the Common Era. Although we think that it dates back earlier than that, but unfortunately, it was completely destroyed by ISIS several years ago. Luckily, all of the murals have been preserved, but the actual building itself was destroyed by ISIS. So unfortunately, it no longer exists. But it was built there probably in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, although we think it represents ideas from much earlier. Absolutely. The idea of fame or memory is a very big deal. If you've ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the things you may know about the Epic of Gilgamesh is that Gilgamesh attempts to get eternal life. He wants to achieve eternal life. And so he goes to meet the only person who ever achieved eternal life, Utnapishtim, the same guy that survived the flood, kind of a precursor to Noah. And he learns you can't survive death. Sorry, there's no way to do it. And so what do? You should get fame for yourself. You should get fame for yourself. And Gilgamesh takes an enormous amount of pleasure in the idea that he's built this enormous city at Uruk. And because he's built this enormous city at Uruk, because he's built these vast walls, he will be remembered forever. Well, he was right. We still talk about Gilgamesh, even though he was forgotten about for about a couple thousand years. What's a couple thousand years in eternity? But the fact that we can still talk about Gilgamesh means that at some level he has survived his death. So absolutely, fame and memory is a big part of the afterlife in these ways, and still a big part of the afterlife, and still a big part of the afterlife now. Rebecca, you're absolutely right. We absolutely think that the geographic and climate conditions in ancient Egypt, ancient Israel, and ancient Mesopotamia directly influence their mythologies. As you may know, the Egyptian flooding cycle in ancient Egypt was relatively stable. There was a stable cycle of flooding, and that flooding always brought new silt, and that always brought incredibly rich earth to ancient Egypt. And the phrase for Egypt, the name for Egypt, the Egyptian name for Egypt, Kemet, means black, and we think that refers to the soil of the region. And so for the ancient Egyptians, religion was relatively peaceful, and the afterlife was quite pleasant. However, over in Mesopotamia, there were also floods by the Tigris and the Euphrates, but those floods were random and terrifying. That's why we get a nasty flood story over there, we think, in Mesopotamia. And so what we get is the idea that in both these legends, right, the afterlife is either imagined relatively nice or relatively not nice based on the kind of culture and the kind of climactic conditions they encountered in their respective regions. However, ancient Canaan was not a hydraulic civilization. It was not built along a major river. However, it relied on the cycle of the winter rains in order to populate the earth. And so, unsurprising, what we get in the Mesopotamian story is an ongoing battle between Baal, the storm and rain god, and Mot, the summer and drought god. And this cycle repeats itself all the time. And so when there were droughts, you prayed to Baal to end those droughts. And so, Rebecca, you're absolutely right to notice that these mythologies are deeply tied to nature, and they're deeply tied to the cyclic processes of the area of the indigenous climates of those regions. And this shouldn't be surprising because many religions link various kinds of divine aspects to things that are occurring on the earth. So unsurprisingly, the underworld is also tied to these kind of climactic conditions and the cultures that produce them. Let's see here, Edward Reich and the concept of Machei Mesim. This is the idea of the resurrection of the body. The earliest examples of the resurrection of the body that we do have 3 examples of physical resurrection in the Hebrew Bible. All 3 examples of physical resurrection in the Hebrew Bible are all 3, for whatever reason, tied directly to the prophets Elijah and Elisha. All three, they all occur in context to Elijah and Elisha. But what's important about all 3 of those concepts in the Hebrew Bible where the resurrection happens is that none of those people had been buried yet. They were relatively freshly dead, I suppose. And they're resurrected from recent death. So we do have some examples where resurrection of the body does occur in the Hebrew Bible, 3 cases, all connected to Elijah and Elisha. But a very robust idea of the resurrection of the dead as a thing that will happen to everybody is a much later idea that we see beginning to develop among the apocalyptic writers, primarily in Daniel, right? This is the Daniel and some sections of Ezekiel with things like the Valley of the Dry Bones, although we think that was largely literary and not a literal resurrection there in the book of Ezekiel. But it's in the next lecture that we'll begin to talk about the competing theories of the afterlives, right? Are you a resurrected soul or a resurrected body or both? Does your soul never die and your body gets resurrected later, or what? And so what we're going to see, Edward, as we get into the apocalyptic mode of Judaism and the rise of the various afterlives in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, that there's going to be a lot of debate about exactly what's going to happen. And of course, there's going to be a lot of debate about it because, well, it hasn't happened yet. And so far as I know, people who have died haven't really come back to tell us much about it. So this concept of the resurrection of the dead, Machei HaMetim, which will become a core idea in Judaism, we will get to next week and next week's lectures, but it does have at least some precursors in the Hebrew Bible. Let's see. Catherine, so the idea, right, that the people, so Utnapishtim and Noah were both picked for reasons of their righteousness. Yeah, they were both picked for reasons of their righteousness. In fact, Utnapishtim was picked because he was good friends with the god Enlil, and Enlil knew that the gods were going to destroy the world. Of course, the world was going to be flooded in the Babylonian story because we were simply making too much noise. The gods were irritated by us, and they decided to flood the world because they were irritated by us. In the Hebrew Bible account, it has to do with the fact that the world was full of violence, Hamas. Noah in the Hebrew Bible it says in the Hebrew Bible that he was righteous according to his generation, which many Christian and Jewish writers say that means that Noah wasn't actually very righteous. He was actually a pretty bad person. And if you read the story of what happened to Noah after he survived the flood, he basically planted a vineyard and got drunk. So many ancient writers thought that Noah was actually just a bad person. He was just the least bad person at the time. Whereas Utnapishtim was actually a very righteous person. He personally knew the god Enlil, and the god Enlil took mercy on Utnapishtim and told Utnapishtim what was going on. and Utnapishtim, Enlil helped him to build told him to build the ark, and by building the ark, Utnapishtim and his family survived. So it wasn't that the Sumerians were arbitrary. Utnapishtim was a very righteous person. In fact, much more righteous than we think Noah was, at least according to the ancient ideas. And in fact, Utnapishtim was so righteous he was actually good friends with the god Enlil. Unlike Noah, who, from many of the ancient accounts, wasn't terribly righteous. He was only righteous in his generation, which was a generation so bad that it had to be, according to the Hebrew Bible, utterly wiped out in order to deal with it. What's also interesting, by the way, is that I mentioned earlier these entities called the Rephaim. The Rephaim, not only does this word Rephaim get used to describe the dead in the Hebrew Bible, it sometimes is used to describe various kinds of giants. And one of the giants that is described as a member of the Rephaim is Og of Bashan. He was a giant who had a giant iron bed in the Bible. And Og of Bashan, if you do the math, he lived through the flood. He survived the flood. He's one of the few people that survived the flood for reasons. And in fact, there's a biblical, midrashic, rabbinical story where he survived by clinging onto the side of the ark, which I always love the image of him clinging onto the side of the ark. In some versions, he rode on the top of the ark. But Og is another one of these Rephaim. Now, again, we don't know what these Rephaim were, but they seem to be unnatural beings that had the ability to survive all kinds of things. And there's a great deal of mythology about them surviving. Again, Og of Bashan surviving the flood of Noah. So again, another weird place where the Hebrew Bible leaves behind memories of stories that originated in ancient Mesopotamia, that originated in ancient Canaan, and they've survived in the Hebrew Bible. But if you don't know they survived in ancient Sumeria, ancient Babylon, or ancient Canaan, you would never know that they were there or even realize how weird they are without the cultural context to make sense of them. So interesting things there, of course, in the Hebrew Bible, and interesting things in the ancient mythologies of the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Canaanites, and of course the ancient Babylonians. So any other questions before we conclude this evening and then pick back up with the later history of the afterlife, the history of the afterlife that will be more familiar to most folks here, I think. Just to point this out, by the way, we are only up to around the year 500, 300 BCE. Civilization began around 5000 BCE as we know it. So for the vast majority of the history of civilization, right, we've only been doing civilization now for about 7,000 years or so. For the vast majority of the history of civilization, the idea of heaven and hell, the idea of a personal afterlife was a minority position, was an absolute minority position. The Israelites did not have it. The Babylonians didn't have it. The ancient people of Ugarit didn't have it. The Egyptians had it. Not even the Greeks had it. You may know, right? Achilles ends up in the afterlife. He's in Hades like with everyone else. And of course, Achilles is a great hero. And when he is resurrected by Odysseus, he tells Odysseus, it's better to be a living dog than a dead lion. I'd rather be a living dog than a dead Achilles. That death is terrible, even for the great hero Achilles. And so even in Greek mythology, there's no sense that the afterlife is good or bad based on what you do. That idea is really an Egyptian idea, and it will be an idea that will only develop around the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE in ancient Judea. So it's a position that occurs in some sense relatively late in the history of the afterlife. It's an idea that develops relatively late, which I think is fascinating, that heaven and hell are kind of newcomers to all this. So more on heaven and hell, of course, next time. Jesse Hicks, why did their views change? We think that part of their views changed actually because of the rise of the middle class, right? That in the development of the Egyptian empire, part of what changed was that you get a pretty robust middle class. You get a robust layer of priests and craftspeople, and that layer of priests and craftspeople have money, or at least they have wealth. What's interesting that people often don't realize is the Egyptians never minted money. There are no Egyptian coins. They never minted money, but they had other forms of wealth. And these other forms of wealth allowed them to enjoy a great deal of leisure time. And what ends up happening is, as Egyptian society develops, we get a kind of middle class. And the middle class see what the aristocrats are doing, just like the middle class in every time sees what the aristocrats are doing. And the middle class says, hey, look, if it's good enough for the aristocrats, it's good enough for me. And so what ends up happening is that the afterlife gets democratized. And by the New Kingdom, roughly about 2500 BCE, the New Kingdom democratizes the afterlife greatly, so that not only is it not just the pharaoh and not just the aristocracy that gets to enjoy the afterlife, but any person can enjoy the afterlife if they are morally upright and the proper rituals are obeyed. So the Egyptians really democratized the afterlife with the rise of something like what we would recognize as a kind of ancient middle class, which is an interesting idea. Interesting idea. Thank you for that question, Jesse. Other last minute questions before we wrap up for the evening and then transition? Yes, this idea that the Egyptians, that the Israelites were in Egypt and would have taken the idea of the afterlife with them. Yes, that would have seemed like a kind of thing they would have done. Although there is no archaeological evidence that the ancient Israelites were ever enslaved in Egypt. In fact, there's very little evidence archaeologically of there being much in the way of slaves in ancient Egypt more generally. People often think that the ancient Israelites built the pyramids and things like this. That didn't happen. The pyramids were built by basically workers who were not working during the agricultural period. We know that aliens didn't build them, and other bizarre ideas, because if you go to the pyramids, you can go to the camp where the workers lived, and you can even see some of their graffiti. It's still there. So I think that the reason why we don't see Egyptian ideas in Israelite theology and in Israelite mythology is because the Israelites just never were in ancient Egypt, and therefore were never actually influenced in a very strong way by ancient Egyptian ideas about the afterlife. The cultural pole was much toward the north, to the Canaanites, and much to the east with the ancient Babylonians. In fact, Israelite literature looks much more like ancient Babylonian literature than it does ancient Egyptian literature, because we actually now have a great deal of ancient Egyptian literature and ancient Mesopotamian literature. And Israelite literature in almost every form looks much more like ancient Mesopotamian literature. So the cultural sphere of influence is actually to the east and not to the west. And unsurprisingly, this also is borne out by the Underworld, that the Israelite idea of Sheol is in fact very much more similar to the Mesopotamian underworld than it is to the Egyptian afterlife. Any other last minute questions? I'm happy to take questions until there's no more. We're just about at 7:30, which I think we're going to conclude at 7:30. So we have just 2 minutes left. Is there any last question or questions? I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, we may conclude for the evening and pick back up next Wednesday at 6 o'clock, where we will get to the flowering of the afterlife. That is to say, the afterlife, the world of heaven and hell, the world of angels and demons. But as we'll see, even that afterlife developed over time. It does not come out of whole cloth, and that the afterlife, as we will see it, as it develops in ancient Judea, also develops a great deal over time. But other than that, folks, I am super happy to have had time to hang out with y'all, to do this talk, and I really look forward to seeing all of you back next week for the next part. And I really appreciate it. Oh, the Kelsey Museum, one of my favorite museums of all time. Robin, I would love to be in touch with you about getting down there to maybe do an episode of my YouTube channel about some of those wonderful incantation bowls you guys have at the Kelsey Museum, an amazing museum at the University of Michigan, folks. If you would ever get down there to check it out, it is a fantastic museum. The Kelsey Museum is amazing. Thank you, Robin. All right, folks, I'm going to say good evening. I wish you all the very best. I will see you next week, and I wish all of you to have a great night, and I will see all of you in a week. Thank you.